This is the Business Chat Podcast. Welcome to the Business Chat. I'm your host, Drew, and we are here in the Industry Expert Series with another industry expert, Michael Solomon. Michael Solomon is an expert, everybody, on consumer behavior. He's a professor at St. Joseph's University at the Haub School of Business in Philadelphia. This gentleman is a public speaker, a consultant, an author. He's a noted scholar, Forbes contributor. They've quoted this guy in the New York Times, USA Today, Adweek, you name it, guys. If you're not convinced we have an industry expert here in consumer behavior, then find me a better one here, because we searched high and low, and Michael's just kind of he's ridiculously qualified. What am I trying to say? He's very good at what he does. We've had some wonderful conversations before the show. Michael, we met on LinkedIn. How you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing great, Drew. Thanks for having me on.
You bet. It's good to see you, and appreciate you, getting ready to, plug your local drink and go through the routine we have here. Before we started the show, you and I were talking about all the things we could talk about in consumer behavior, and you're another guest I've got where it's just, there's not enough time on the show. I'll just say that up front. This guy's doing so much. He's got so many interesting things to say, courses, content on his site. I'll put it out there first to say, you guys that are listening, head over to michaelsolomon.com and see all that he's got to offer from courses that you can take, and we'll get into more of that later, from the books that we're going to talk about. Namely, today it's going to be about The New Chameleons, his latest book. But before we get into all the things that Michael does in consumer behavior, Michael, what are you drinking today?
Well, Drew, I've got my Old City coffee, which is available at the famous Reading Terminal in beautiful downtown Philadelphia, where I live.
Excellent. That's kind of your local spot. That's not a new coffee for you.
No.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I've got 71 coffee here. And again, I've relocated, for those of you that have followed the show, from almost from west to east coast, from the Los Angeles area out here to the Metro Detroit area. 71 coffee it's a good roast. We're going to post a lot about what they do, some of the cause behind the roaster that provides the beans for that coffee. But without any further interruptions or ado, let's do the virtual cheers, Michael. And again, welcome to the show, my friend.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. I love it.
Again, in consumer behavior here, and by day, I'm a marketing guy. And so when our producer here, Benjamin, and I, work together to find you folks out here, and there's so many of you, interesting people, not just on LinkedIn, but just around the world, I was interested. And like so many of the guests, I get into what you guys do, but I really did find the title of your book fascinating. Before we kind of go into the book, and I've mentioned it a couple of times because it just really is the topic today of all things you can talk about. Tell us, a little bit about your, overview of who you are for folks listening. I mentioned all these things that you do. You're a professor, you're a speaker, consultant. Kind of give us a story how you got into this discipline, this line of work.
Well, Drew, first I'll warn you, never ask a professor to talk about what he or she does, because then they're going to answer and be here all day. But the short story is I've been a business marketing professor for about 40 years at this point. I originally was going to be a social psychologist, and so I got my doctorate in social psychology, but quickly realized that a lot of my interests were more appropriate in the business area, in marketing, because I was doing a research on, I began by doing research on the psychology of fashion, and it's hard to believe by looking at me, but I've been pretty active in that area.
Talking about, come on, this is not.
Yeah.
Hey, look, you're great for 51, by the way, too, man. Hey,
well, Dave, thanks. I'm going to just let that one pass. But so I've been doing this a long time. I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of great companies to help them understand their customers. Some of them are in the fashion space, but I've had the opportunity to work in financial services, transportation, sports, on and on. Because once you get into it and you start to understand the roles that products play in our lives and that brands play in our lives, it's just the holy grail for a social scientist to look at all this stuff. And as I got into this, I realized that most people were sort of taking this for granted. They would say, sure, you buy a Lamborghini or a Louis Vuitton bag or something. Yeah, that's pretty important. But the everyday stuff, who really cares about that? And the answer is, we care about it a lot. The brands that we use, whether it's stuff we put on our bodies or in our bodies or around our bodies, this is a central way that we communicate with one another, and even with ourselves, to tell ourselves who we are. So as I got into this, and I had the opportunity to work with some great companies. My first consulting client way back was Levi Strauss, and I did a lot of fun work with them on the psychology of blue jeans, and kind of took it from there. It's just fascinating, and I know we'll get into this some more. But when you look at the role that brands play in our lives, it's really something most people just need to think about it more. And frankly, I'm amazed at how many marketers do not understand that. They're still thinking about selling nuts and bolts. They're not selling the experiences that people are looking for. So, that's my mission. I write textbooks, I consult, I speak, but basically it's all about understanding the life of the everyday person, you and me, and how we use products like local coffee or whatever it is to actually create an identity for ourselves, and to understand how brands create that identity. So by your plugging these local brands, you're talking about the causes that they work for and so on. Yeah. You're telling a great brand story about that probably smaller brand, but that's the way they grow. It's not by making the most tasty coffee that anyone's ever had, although that doesn't hurt, but telling the story behind that coffee is what really does it.
And you're highlighting all the things. The brand, in quotes, is the experience in every sensory way, right? Digital, if it's food and beverage, if it's clothing. It doesn't hurt that Levi's actually have a great filling pair of jeans and coats and those kind of things. But it's really that we see celebrity interacting with those brands. It's really that we were reinforced by lifestyle photography and exactly the imagery projected. So yeah, I love it. You and we kind of have the same DNA in a sense. You're bringing a science to the art that probably even I will confess, I could use I could use some time and go back to the books on that. But yeah, for folks listening, we are in the ever critical first 10 minutes to hold their attention, Michael. So here's an unscripted rapid fire question for you as a brand guy, as a consumer behavior expert. And I'm not going to ask you to throw any brands under the bus. I'm only going to ask this. What's one or two for you personally that you go, these guys are really killing it. They're doing it right. And you don't have to get into why. Just name a couple for you that you go, oh yeah, these do branding well.
Well, I guess I probably have to name some of my clients, don't I?
I mean, like I said, this is for you, friend. You plug away.
Yeah, I think a lot of the the younger oriented, especially apparel brands, are doing a really good job of this. Patagonia, right? It's been in the news now because he's given away the company and all that. So Patagonia has been a great brand story for many years, and I'm sure will continue to be. Telling the story of sustainability and the greater good and all that. But some brands like what am I thinking of? Lululemon, for example.
Sure.
The ability of these guys to really read the tea leaves, to understand that at any point in time, people are looking to gratify certain needs, to express certain identities, but that does not stay, stuck in time, especially in our society. Boom, it's already changed. We're already onto something else. And so if you don't kind of get beneath the surface and really get to what your customers are looking for, you can't adapt when they do. But being able to see something coming, like say the wellness craze, and how does yoga and other things fit into that, and then translating that and being able to execute on that at the store level, that's a great example of really being able to anticipate consumer behavior. Now, what happens with some companies is they do such a good job, they think, okay, I can tick that box, and everybody puts their feet up and retires, and then next week they're nothing, so you just because you've made it today doesn't mean you're going to make it tomorrow. And that's, I think, one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of big brands make. Just, hey, I'm big. You know who I am. It's up to you to find out if I'm changing.
No, it's true. And it's funny. I see a lot of, these emerging markets when there's demand and need and there's only two key players. I think some of that sets in. These startups are busy and then they quickly are a Fortune 500 name, but they're kind of unchallenged. And then overnight they wake up and go, oh man, there's 10, 15, 100 smaller regional players that are just competing on brand, and can do circles around them because they, like you said, tap into consumer behavior. And it's something as those folks that are listening, whether they're in a B2B, obviously, Michael, you come with a focus on consumer products. That is, when we're talking more of a direct to consumer, wearables and food and beverage, that kind of thing, technology. But that's a great segue you just said about, I love that, by the way, reading the tea leaves. I'm stealing that this week somewhere. That is absolutely on point with my next question about the title of your book, which is the new chameleon. My question on that is, what is the new chameleon? Because you basically just laid out what you said. Folks check out, they get a little arrogant, or like you said, I love at the beginning, you said they take it for granted. So where are we at today? When you say the new chameleon, tell everybody what you're talking about.
Yeah, so I think, everybody's probably familiar with what chameleons do. They change their skin color to adapt to the circumstances, camouflage, etc. We do that in a sense as well, but what we change is our identities. And, in the old days, 20, 30 years ago, our identities were, for the most part, for most of us, they were pretty set. But what do I mean by identities? You're a spouse, you're a business person, you're an athlete, and on and on. Each of these identities require certain brands to kind of make them happen, And back in the day, we used to rely on these big companies that we've been talking about to pretty much tell us, if you want to be a good father or a good husband, these are the brands you're going to buy, and this is what you do with them. So it was very much a passive, top-down kind of process. But today, a lot of consumers have woken up and they've become reptiles. They've become chameleons in the sense that we change our colors. We change our identities often several times during a day. We think about ourselves differently depending on, right now you are suave and sophisticated podcast host, but 2 hours from now, judging by that guitar I see in the background there, you're going to be a very different kind of person.
Yeah, sure. No, that's right. That's a keen observation. I should put some other things out there. Messing. That's absolutely right. I pick up what you're saying. So the new chameleons. I'm sorry, I misquoted the title. The chameleons, plural. Are you saying that's it's talking about the nature of the folks aren't one thing? They're complex. Is that kind of what I'm hearing from you? There's multiple buying habits and things.
Yes, but it goes a little deeper than that because as we're changing these identities and we're learning new identities, and by the way, a lot of that is due to the good old internet and so on, because I don't have to see you on the street corner playing your guitar. I can watch your video playing the guitar, and so I can observe all kinds of lifestyles of people not only in my neighborhood but around the world. And of course, marketers have a lot to say about what I see. But the point is that consumers are much more proactive about changing these identities, wanting to acquire new identities, and using brands very freely to kind of trade them in and out depending on the particular roles that they want to play. Unfortunately, most marketers are still trapped back in the 1960s and 70s when it was very feasible to take a big market, say the United States, adults in the United States, divide that up into some pretty large, somewhat homogeneous groups like, women in their 30s or what have you.
Stay-at-home men, teenagers.
Exactly. Yeah. And then roll out products and messages that are designed to meet that. So, that avatar, sometimes it's called that persona.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Persona.
But the problem is that people don't want to be, cookie cutter like that. And especially when I talk to my students, certainly, and I say to them, if I'm a marketer, I look at my class, if I've got 35 kids sitting here and you're all 20 years old and you're all, attending a fairly expensive private liberal arts school in the Northeast, et cetera, therefore you're all identical, right? And so if I'm a marketer, I could just give you one message and everybody's going to buy what I have, right? And of course, they look at me like I'm from Mars because each of them thinks of themselves as an individual. Now, obviously, their choices overlap and they're affected by conformity and things. I'm not saying everybody's a total individual, although we like to think of ourselves that way. But what we see is that a lot of the basic categories that we've used for many years, and mea culpa, I've used them to categorize people. The basic cultural categories I'm talking about no longer work, and by those basic categories, I talk about a bunch of them in the book. But for example, male versus female, right? We've always, you're either marketing to men or to women, and yet you look at the cultural conversations going on today. A lot of people will say there's no such thing as being male or female. It's a continuum, and we could talk about that for 30 years. But the point is, if you're a marketer and you think that your people are still thinking of themselves as just, the old fashioned view of a male or of a female in our society, you're missing a lot of opportunities to connect with people who may not be in your core market. So just like a quick example, say you make accessories for women, bracelets or bags and stuff like that. Well, the cultural definitions are changing, and there's a lot more men out there who are wearing, like lift up your left arm there if you don't mind. Are you wearing you've got a bracelet on, right?
Right.
So that's a real feminine product there, Drew. But today.
There's one thing I didn't know you that well. We're getting to know one another. I said, this man's picking me apart, and he can't help it because he's a consumer behavior expert.
That's right.
From the facial hair to what I've chosen to put on. It's just, and I kind of am enjoying this right now. I feel like I'm in the lab or whatever. Yeah, no.
Yeah. But my point is that, if I'm making that nice looking bracelet you've got on, I've never thought of Drew as a customer. I'm never going to reach Drew. You know what I mean? So I'm basically walking away from half of the population in that case, or at least some proportion of that. Yeah. So a lot of these categories, we really have to question old versus young, rich versus poor, black versus white, marketer versus customer. That's a huge one. Many customers are marketers today. They're driving limos, they're renting out their houses, they're cooking meals for people. So a lot of our traditional assumptions are obsolete, and yet most of us haven't figured that out because we're still operating using that old cultural lens. And of course, the pandemic, people say, well, the pandemic changed everything. Pandemic didn't change anything. All it did was accelerate things that were already happening. And this is an example of that, So, for example, we like to think there's a boundary between humans and robots or androids. And yet today we start to see a lot. That's a category I talk about in the book. And yet today we see that, a robot was granted citizenship by Saudi Arabia, a robot that was made in Japan. And then flesh and blood people many of us have machinery inside of us, whether it's pacemakers or contact lenses and things like that. So these basic boundaries that we assume define our universe, the way we make sense of our universe, in a sense, are really evaporating. And it's time to adjust to that and to recognize that, the technology today, there are a lot of privacy and ethical issues around this, but the technology today does allow us to think about not a big mass market, but literally markets of one, where I can tailor my offering to you. Certainly we see this in the political landscape today. You could literally be getting a different political message than your next door neighbor based on your, the things that you've looked at in the past, causes you've supported, et cetera.
That piece fascinates me as a music fan, that I can mention the name of an artist to someone that packs out arenas and plays, 200 dates a year with 6 million fans, and yet I could go around and talk to 25, I could talk to 100 people and they've never heard of them. That speaks to not just the volume of art that's out there, but also that, like you said, the options, the marketing that goes out there it's different, it's smart. The brands have expanded. I mentioned music as one that's obviously been totally deregulated, and it's in a great place, by the way, with wonderful art and folk, accessibilities to the ceiling. But the same thing with brands. You can now come and compete on quality, on the lifestyle brand, project an image that people want to be against a Levi's. That's a local boutique. as a full online e-com realtor. And in some cases, these liquor guys, I've noticed, they're a little more nimble and flexible. The things you're talking about, they're able to be.
Sure.
Levi Strauss is publicly traded. They've got folks with the older way of thinking. And for marketers listening, I wanted to circle back on something. You kind of dropped an atom bomb on a lot of what folks in that discipline go, well, hold on a minute, Michael, like we just spent money on consulting and on building personas and avatars. And, basketball is sold to boys and lipstick is for girls. And, Acura and Mercedes SUVs are for, we all know 55 and over, and primarily Caucasian, these kind of things. And you're going, that can get you into trouble at the least. And at most, you're missing opportunity. What I wanted to connect that to was one of the chapters in your book, talks about how we buy, nonlinear, right? That the new chameleons shop by committee. And so I kind of wanted to agree with you by mentioning all that, but throw another one in there. What does that mean, the folks shop by committee? Because I think you're just really bringing up some really good insight for owners listening, but also marketers are going, yeah, I think we know what you're saying, and maybe you can connect the dots.
Yeah, I mean, for the last, depending how you count it, 70, 80 years, my colleagues and I and others, have done tons of research on how consumers make decisions. Most of that is based on an assumption that the consumer is a lone decision maker. So he or she is standing in the aisle looking at 5 different brands and, weighing the pros and cons of each, and how does our brain process that, et cetera. But the reality is, and people who study brands know this because they act the same way. We rarely make those decisions in isolation, but the reality is many times we're buying things jointly. If we're shopping for a family, we're buying for other people. If we're making, B2B decisions, we're buying a new computer system that hundreds of people are going to use. And yet, we don't really think about that very much. We don't think about this idea that there's so many social influences out there weighing on us. And very often, especially, when we bow to peer pressure or something, and of course it's more acute when you're younger, but I don't think it ever goes away. You might look at something in your closet that you owned 10 years ago and you say, what was I thinking? Well, what you were thinking is, gee, will people like this? Will people approve of this? This notion of the lone decision maker is really not, I don't think it was ever true, but certainly with social media today, what we see and when I'm talking about the so-called hive mind that I discuss in the book, especially younger people are, what I find is that people are more and more reluctant to make a decision without getting feedback from others first. So in the old days, we might go through this decision-making process, and then we buy something, and then we look for feedback, and our friends say, oh, that's great, or return that, what were you thinking? But the reality is today that we're ironically doing a lot more work when we make purchases. The internet was supposed to make our lives easier. It makes it a lot harder because of the amount of research that people do for many ordinary, and I'm not talking about luxury cars, I'm talking about where do I go to lunch today? A lot of people really have to get buy-in from their networks. And we talk about eating, so-called food porn. You've probably heard that expression. And people there's a whole genre now, people taking pictures of their food and posting it on Instagram before they can eat it. I've had students tell me that their boyfriend or girlfriend broke up with them, but they didn't know it until they read about a relationship change on Facebook. So we tend to announce our comings and goings, share them with this, group, that our network that we have, our BFFs, all 3,000 of them, and we're constantly getting buying information. In the old days, if we needed something, then we would start to look for information about it. But because we're getting this 24/7 feed, we're for people who are really tied into that, they're constantly getting these buy recommendations, or they're getting feedback about what they did, even if they didn't ask for it. So it's the model, back in the 60s and 70s, you weren't around then, but I sort of was.
You can just say it. Just say the good old days when you say that.
The good old days, yes. It was all about do your own thing, even though we all didn't do our own thing. We actually looked like everybody else doing their own thing. But at least the motto was be an individual. Today it's, well, how do I know what I want until I see what other people post? So it's much more of a consensus building operation where that feedback loop is much more immediate and much more frequent.
And you're right when you talk about how it never was individual shopping on their own with their own information. It also wasn't the way, look at celebrity influencer marketing pre, the analog days, the good old days. People conveniently all started looking like Bob Dylan in the East Village, just like when the Beatles took the stage that day on the Sullivan Show, that haircut showed up. And that's just one example of fashion and celebrity influencing and that kind of thing. Fast forward to 2022, and as I canvass the country and do a lot more travel than I'd predicted in my adult years, I noticed the food is kind of becoming, what's a lack of better word? It's exciting. There's food everywhere, but it's all kind of this homogenized, like, wait a minute, this tastes like Austin barbecue and I'm in New Jersey. It's not quite the same, by the way, for those in Austin that are about to, totally annex my show, blacklist me. But my point is people went brisket, what? Now you go to the average plate, everyone's got an IPA, every chef is looking at every Instagram's user-generated content, not other chefs. They're looking at, you mentioned the food porn bit, and it's informing in a way, and I'm referencing now the connectedness of the early 2000s, mid-2000s. Today, whole brands are launched with so much more data, information that users are posting thanks to social feeds, that they can drill down on a geographic area. Yeah. And like you said, find more of this single hyper-focused persona or personas that, again, defy and a little bit fly in the face of, with respect, what a Levi's and a Coca-Cola and a Nike's even able to do just due to who they are and their size, right? And I don't know if you had any comment on that with just newer stuff.
Yeah, well, I do. I want to go back to your Beatles example, watching the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, because I remember watching the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. I think I was about 8 years old. I think I was about 8 years old at the time. But the point is that's a great example because it shows you how our culture has fragmented. So we talk about cultural fragmentation. When the Beatles appeared on Ed Sullivan in, was it 64, something like that, most of the country is tuned in. At that time we had 3 TV stations, maybe 4 in some places. So if you wanted to reach a broad swath of the United States, you could go on, buy time on Ed Sullivan, and you'll do that. Today, that is not possible, maybe with the Super Bowl, but that's the only exception. But rather today, when you look at musical subcultures, and you were alluding to this before, I may never have heard of you, but you have 100,000 followers. And so, or 1 million. And so what that means is instead of having these massive group followings, it's more like this, if you know what I mean. And so it's the intensity is much deeper, but the numbers are smaller. And that's why mass market segmentation is no longer as valuable as it used to be. Because the people that you want in your franchise, if you're a brand, are those people who are, very zealously following you as a musician. It's like the old 80-20 rule. 20% of your customers account for 80% of your revenues. And so the real target that you want to get is that person who not only knows you, but, is practically stalking you in terms of your musical output. Right. Because they're not only going to be a loyal, consumer, but they're also going to be an evangelist. That's your best sales force, is your dedicated customer.
Yeah, and as a guitar player, you mentioned that's another great one that I know firsthand. I know your large franchise, your Guitar Centers, right? Sort of the Costco of musical equipment. They know that continuing to project imagery of the teen rocking out in his garage or the slightly successful 20-year-old is still the way to go because he's the one nudging mom and dad to get their wallet out to buy said equipment. Where in reality, they get up at Guitar Center corporate, they know that it's a bunch of us old fuddy-duddies with kids, with 10 to 14-year-old kids that are, so we're old rockers and players, and I see it. When I walk in the stores, I kind of look around and go, they're catching up, not as quickly as they probably wanted to when things just totally went crazy in the e-com boom at the early 2000s, but it's very much catered now to the guy that fancies himself a rocker that's no longer 21 years old and his kid. And so you see that even in generational photography and advertising with brands, at least acknowledging, hey, there's So like you said, one of the chameleons aspect I see is just these kind of family purchasing concepts. A car that, yeah, the dad's proud of, but really it's great for the kids. And Honda's doing a better job kind of showing that it's not just you showing up with your top down and it's just this, hey, midlife crisis dude in his car, but it's like aspects of all of the product and stuff. So
and so when I was saying that, one of the categories is young versus old, and in my day, we used to say never trust anyone over 30 until you turn 30 and you realize you could be trusted. But today, I've heard this anecdotally a number of times, especially for girls, their moms are their best friends. Their moms are their shopping partners. Retailers have told me, we have a lot of mother-daughter, pairs that come into the store. And that means there's been a fundamental realignment of categories, because your parent is no longer your enemy. Your parent is your friend these days. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not. But
correct. In the parent of the 1980s, my parents, as I was a kid growing up in the 80s, those parents did not have Instagram in their back pocket. They were not shopping on Amazon, and they come from overwhelmingly more, let's say conservative families, and they're former hippies. And so now you see today's mom is no longer that same look as your generation, whether it's 50s or 60s or even in the 80s, kind of that traditional minivan kind of moms now, in quotes. It kind of blurs. I mean, I'd be just totally straight with you, Mike. I walk around and go, I don't know which of those two is the mom and daughter. And I don't just mean by height and fashion, but it's really my way of saying that kind of has changed culturally. So you're right. That they have to be aware of the fact that it's not pitting against, it's both. And man, we really, like I said, these 30-minute shows of mine are just, they're nowhere near the depth that we go. But I mean, with all that you said, I think the kind of closing question or topics I wanted to make sure our listeners are hearing, because again, if you're listening and you're catching part of it, head over to michaelsolomon.com, where you can see not only to check out the new Chameleons book, but just all that Michael's doing and talking about. He's been doing this for a long time. Whether you're a business, whether you're in marketing, I'm learning a lot from the guy just right now. Michael, as you engage with companies, you mentioned consulting, working with clients, speaking, coming to events and things. What struggles do you mostly hear in the last year or two them having? What's the number one thing they go, hey, Mike, you could help me out with? We're really having an issue with X. In general, what are you hearing right now?
Yeah. Well, the answer is pretty simple, but it's pretty important, and that is engaging your customers. And just, I tell my students this we have lots of challenges today in marketing, but the single biggest challenge is just getting people's attention in a world where we're so distracted, and pop-ups or things are popping up all around us, and we're multitasking and all of that. And so I'm really focusing a lot of my efforts, have an online course on this topic of engagement, and how do you move people along a continuum from being really bored and just buying out of habit, which describes 90% of the purchases we make, to being what I call brand fanatics. People, and we see lots of brands, the ones we've been talking about, that really inspire, let's call it almost a level of religious devotion. And so if you compare that kind of
exaggerative at all, I think that's almost when you see a brand that you go, they're not even, like you said, they sit on their hands and go, look, we're the big brand. Those are their followers. They're almost right, correct.
And so you see, if you can bottle that secret sauce, that passion for brands, that really changes your job as a marketer. Doesn't mean you sit back and don't sell your product, but that's the way you get people to pay attention to what you have to say. And basically the short story is, I mean, I have a 6-hour course on this, but the short story is, people don't buy products, they buy stories. They want to know, what is your brand? What's its background? I'm going to assume that it works, because today, most of the stuff we buy works reasonably well. And when you talk to customers and you say, look, here's 5 brands in a category, which one do you like? They may pick a Nike because it has a great story, but very often they'll say, they're all pretty similar. Yeah, they all work fine. And of course, that makes branding people crazy, but that's the customer's perspective. And so the only time they kind of, rouse themselves from their slumber is when you give them a brand that's really connecting with their identity, with what I was talking about before, these chameleons looking to express identities. If you give them a brand that enables them to do that, I won't say they're yours for life, but they're yours for this year at least. Nobody's yours for life, but that is how you move from being a commodity brand, a Me Too brand, to being something that really means something to people. And I don't care what category it is, and it's not just B2C, by the way, it's B2B as well. There's usually one, maybe two brands in a category that are just so dominant because they have a story behind them. Like, many of the founder stories in Silicon Valley, we started the company in a garage. I mean, every Silicon Valley company started in the same garage,
Some shed they were all in sharing together.
That's right. Yeah. So that gives you something. You're not just selling a printer, you're selling a founder story.
That's right.
And yet so many companies have not figured this out, and they're still trying to sell functionality in an age when we don't need it because we can assume it's there.
This always fascinates me about guys like you, and you in particular, Mike. We've had a few of these conversations, all too short, but you just said we don't need functionality, and I know what you mean, but unpack that for 30 seconds. When you say we don't, I think you said it pretty well, but I'll give you an example to unpack what we don't need. Look at Apple, a little bit overused example maybe sometimes, but I've never seen anybody come up to me and talk about the, megapixels and the storage capacity and how great the titanium is. Is that kind of what you're talking about? Like Apple got off selling that. They just show people dancing with really cool phones.
Yeah. I mean, what I've noticed is kids, especially, many kids don't realize you can use an iPhone to make a telephone call, as well as the other things that it does. But it
rings, right? And they look at it and they go, "What the hell is this thing doing?" Right?
Yeah.
That's a phone.
But I guess my point is, there's little doubt that whatever phone you buy is going to connect your phone call. But Apple's story is largely about design rather than functionality, about ease of use, and frankly, the bragging rights to say that you're part of the Apple community. That's part of the story.
You just tied it all in. And for those of you listening that may have missed that, and I hope not, what Michael's saying is something that, again, in my day job, and I see this, and I've seen this in my very short career here in marketing, is that the mistake made, and that was what I was going to ask in closing. What the common mistake is, I think you and I both are agreeing, and you said it better than I could have. We're selling functionality where no one's needing that or looking for it. And I love how you close it. It's assumed your iPhone will make a call. It's assumed that your jeans are made well. It's assumed that your automobile is top rated in those things. People want to fall in love with the brand. They want to know the story. They love both. They want an experience. And I think that it can be difficult when, again, you don't realize your buyer's new chameleon nature, not just with technology, but as Michael did a great job pointing out. I love that you bring this, by the way. It's not just I'm here to tell you what's changed in 2023. It's a walk back through the psychology, the logic, the fact that we're watching with how the Beatles do their hair, what they wear. We care not just with celebrity, but we buy as a group, as a committee, as you put it. So that's really great wisdom. So in closing, Michael, folks listening going, this is the kind of thing I could use as a tune-up for my business. Plug away, my friend. I recommend you go right to the website. But Michael, you recommend they pick up a copy of your book? Is the course the best way for an owner, a company, and their marketing team to start? What do you recommend?
Yeah, well, certainly the course. It's got a lot of content. It's about 6 hours of content, but it's gonna take you through some of the standard approaches to building awareness and, understanding how people, we don't become brand fans overnight. We first have to learn what the brand is and what it does before we're going to do that. So there's a process, but at each stage of the process, what I do is review some of the ways we can further, more closely tie the consumer to the product, service, or store by basically attaching meanings to the product that go beyond just the functionality. And I don't want your audience to think that product quality is not important. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's assumed today. It's the price of admission, but you definitely need it. I'm not advocating.
I think it was made well that where the marketing focus shouldn't so much be on the tech spec manual of the product as it is, what it is means for them to join that brand, right? Like you said, to be carrying around that brand and engaging.
Right.
And I love that you brought up Patagonia. Family member of mine mentioned that the other day. I was kind of head in the sand on that news. Wasn't aware, but after kind of diving into what that really does, that statement, that's a big one right now in that industry, not just fashion, but subcategory of the kind of the more outdoors, green, sustainable, renewable, all of that conversation. And I'm going to be watching Patagonia. It's very interesting, the shockwave that sent. So, well, Michael, I mean, like I said at the outset, I mentioned a couple times, you and I could go all day because we kind of have that. We have the same marketing vein, but I almost feel like just kind of sitting in here and you talk a little longer. I'm going to be checking out the course. Those of you listening and watching, again, head over to michaelsolomon.com. It's the easiest way to find out what he's doing. Check him out on LinkedIn. We're going to link everything here at the end of the show. Special thanks again to the brands that Michael and I were unashamedly plugging for our little hot beverages here today. And man, I think we need to just have you back to the show, Michael. Are you up for coming back sometime?
Anytime. Maybe you could teach me to play the guitar.
We definitely could. I mean, fellas, it seems like we have a few things in common. We could talk music. We can talk music marketing. It's been a real pleasure, and we'll look forward to seeing you again, Michael. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks.
We'll talk soon.
Thanks, Drew.